Welcome to Thinking Through the Darkness, a Lore by Spec podcast, with me, your host, Spec. This is a podcast where we talk through all of the pre-production that goes into making the theories that you see on the Lore by Spec channel and its associated channels. Let's get the shilling out of the way first. If you haven't gone and subscribed and liked and commented on the videos on Lore by Spec on the YouTube channel, please go ahead and do that now. That's one of the best ways that you can support me. This podcast is also available anywhere that you can find podcasts. So if you are listening, if you could like the podcast and maybe leave a little review, that does wonders for the algorithm on the podcast side, which really helps. And if you want to help support this podcast, this is the only one that currently doesn't use free tools. And since it's a paid thing, if you have the means to contribute to this, the link for this is in my description for my Ko-Fi. This helps me keep the light on and pay for all of the things that go into making this podcast a quality project. So I'm coming at today's podcast from the perspective of we're all mature enough to have a conversation that a lot of people probably aren't going to be particularly thrilled about. I'm coming at this with the knowledge that that is so. But I want to think about the impact that the Twilight Town trio had on the plot of Kingdom Hearts 3, specifically the end of Kingdom Hearts 3, and if whether or not their impact or presence in Kingdom Hearts 3, more specifically towards the end, was really necessary. And can we look back on it in maybe a different lens? Because I am aware that Tetsuya Nomura and Kou did say that there were initially no plans for Roxas, Xion and Lea to be in 3, because largely their stories were concluded in 2, and that it was due to fan demand that they ended up making reappearance in 3. I want to kind of take that apart a little bit today, because looking back on it, I would largely have agreed with them. Kingdom Hearts 3 is a very dense game, and there's a lot to get through when you consider just how little time the things that should have gotten attention didn't. And maybe it's worth looking at it through that lens of, if we couldn't detract from any of the Disney games and the Disney elements from the games, how were we going to deliver Roxas and Xion and Lea in a way that made it satisfactory to the players and the people who wanted them back? And I think that we can definitely say that they did the best that they possibly could, given the limitations of what they had in terms of scope for where they could be inserted and what exactly that looked like for the final battle. But can we also take a step back to acknowledge the fact that it wasn't necessary either for the story for them to be there? That emotionally it was satisfying, but in terms of narrative, not necessarily. Because ultimately, they hadn't at that point properly fleshed out the numbers of the people who needed to clash. And I think something that might be interesting is if the number of Guardians of Light that were due to clash minus Roxas, Xion, and Lea, what other three could we have had in their stead that we potentially might have missed out on? It would be interesting to see what the original plan there was, even though I don't think we're ever going to see it. But I think it's interesting to think about and to consider the possibility of who else could have taken their place. It might have been an interesting point that the three who come in could have been Ephemer, Scold, and Brain if we were really going hard in on the life to the past stuff. That could have been an interesting potential other three Keyblade holders to have. But admittedly, I understand that for the majority of players who haven't been playing anything except the numbered base games, that that would have been a confusing thing to do. But equally, I mean, the same could be said for Xion. If you hadn't played any of the other games, you would have no idea who Xion was or the impact there for her. Lea you would have just known from Kingdom Hearts 2, but you might not have put together there was a deeper connection between him and Lea other than that bit you see at the start of Kingdom Hearts 2. So the argument of it might be more confusing for people probably doesn't really work when if you take into consideration the people who have just played the numbered games. I would imagine it would have been that whole sequence would have been equally as confusing if you have just played the numbered entries. Because who are these people and why would you care? And why? I mean, I can imagine that the question probably more practically probably would have been why is Nominate dark haired? You know, wasn't Nominate blonde? Why is her name Xion now? I can imagine that that would have been more of the core confusion for people who had only played 1 and then 2, wandering into the end game of 3. So the notion of, oh, well, it wouldn't really have worked, it would have been too confusing, doesn't really stack. Then we have to consider it from another perspective, right? So Roxas, I mean, Roxas was universally liked. You know, his absence from KH2 always kind of felt unresolved. But, like, does he actually do anything beyond the Keyblade Graveyard sequence? Does his return change the outcome in any meaningful way? I'd say no. Not really. Like, ultimately, what does Roxas actually do? Except for succeeding in making sure that Isa goes back to who he was and pushing basically Xemnas and Kou into the final stage for the next boss battle. But what does his, like, appearance structurally do? We don't even really get any sort of hints that any of the trios return for them having bodies has any sort of wider implication. Because there's something kind of unsaid when we give a nobody a vessel or something that shouldn't have a vessel or maybe is just missing their vessel, suddenly a vessel, right? Because what happens if Kyrie and Sora get, you know, get their hearts removed again, which is happening quite at a, you know, continuous rate, really, if you think about it. They're not exactly they're all kind of dying at an alarming rate in Kingdom Hearts, but never permanently. So what does that mean for the people who were previously their nobodies? Do they get yeeted from their new vessels now? Do they now develop another new set of nobodies? Because if your heart has been removed, and if you're a particularly strong person, you turn into a heartless and a nobody, and then your spirit goes elsewhere, I guess. But what does that mean for the next time you die? What does that mean for the next time that Sora will invariably die? In Kingdom Hearts 4, when we inevitably, you know, end up getting him killed in some silly way. What does that mean for Roxas? Because the logic here for me has always been that when we get to those ending death scenes, especially in 2, at least that canonically makes sense for Roxas's subsequent appearance, because hey, he has, you know, Sora has died multiple times. At this point, it's only natural that his nobody self would still exist. But how does that work when the nobody themselves are no longer nobodies and they're actual people? And what happens if we play them in future entries? Will they end up having nobody versions of themselves? Does this all just turn into, like, those Russian nesting dolls where there's just smaller versions of somebody else inside a bigger version? So we introduce a lot of confusion to the lore, and we introduce a lot of questions that don't necessarily have any good answers, like with much things to do in this series, that there are no good answers. But, like, we spent so long trying to hammer home across multiple games, like across most of the last saga, defining what is or is not a heartless, what is or is not a nobody, how they can interact with each other, and how they can move and interact with things. So suddenly putting them in vessels that aren't inherently theirs changes the structure of what they ultimately become. And if we fundamentally give a nobody a body, then they become a full person, full of their own emotions and memories and all the rest, right? The ability to develop hearts. And when we do that, I feel like that unnecessarily opens a can of worms to something that was always meant to be the end of this specific saga, right? And by giving them bodies, while emotionally resonant, actually puts you in a worse writing position narratively down the line. Because ultimately, what does that mean? It's a bit like one of the things that has come for me quite a bit in all the times I've been editing and sitting through the Kingdom Hearts 4 trailer again is the fact that we will be fighting in Scala. Or at least in that specific instance, there is fighting happening in Scala. If Scala, or not Scala, if Quadratum is an afterworld, an afterlife, where they are already dead and this is technically limbo, or the next version of life, and this is not connected to, because this is distinct that this is unreality, so we can't assume that they are bound by the same cycle of life and death as we have described it in Kingdom Hearts terms as birth by sleep, right? So if we're not going to be close to stations of awakening or the final world, then what exactly is going to happen when we inevitably get Sora killed in 4 in Quadratum? Where will Sora end up? Will he develop Nobodies? Will his body separate into a Heartless? Because, I mean, that is a Darksider. So it's safe to assume that from that and the stills of the Neo Shadows that we see, that Heartless still exist in unreality. But if this is unreality, stuff that's meant to be completely separate and bound by different sets of rules and interactions and everything else, why exactly are we still fighting Neo Shadows and Darksiders? Surely such a thing is impossible in unreality because it's meant to be the complete opposite of what the things that we have seen and encountered in the realm of light, realm of darkness, and realms of between. It's meant to be the distinct opposite of that. So how can that manifest if it's not meant to exist? If it by its own definitions cannot exist, with it being an afterlife. So I'm curious about that because that inherently has ramifications down the line. Not just for when we inevitably, like I keep saying, like as we inevitably will have murdered Sora at one stage or another in 4 in Quadratum, but from a perspective of what we know about what happens when a soul perishes, we now do not know how that impacts Nobodies in 4. And I would argue that, yeah, like I would just argue that opening up Xion and Naminé and Roxas getting bodies makes a lot of those things far more difficult to explain, but also far more difficult to write around. Because while I do think, and I've expressed this before, particularly in other episodes, that I do think that there is an opportunity for a great rewrite to happen here, a necessary rewrite to happen here as to what we think and how we approach looking at things like the Keyblade and things like how we're going to retcon all the stuff that happened in Union Cross. How far do we want to drag back the stuff from Union Cross into this? How are we going to blend in the story bits of what was written in Missing Link? And really kind of, I think it's necessary for them to audit quite strictly in that. And I'm not sure how you explain it because you'll need to explain it because somebody's gonna ask as to why, if it's naturally occurring, if you have a strong heart and nobody gets created from that strong heart, then it's a naturally occurring property that occurs. And if you remove something that is naturally occurring from your body, what does it then get replaced with? Because it needs to be replaced in order for there to be balance. And if you don't address it, then you're going to end up losing a good chunk of what the series has been talking about being uncomfortable with the middle, right? The uncomfortableness with the unknown. Because it implies inherently that this uncomfortableness can be fixed by just having the right connections, by finding somebody who has a doll handy that you can inhabit. And I'm not sure that's the tact that they want to go with for this, to explain it away, because the whole point of it was that it was meant to be uncomfortable. It was meant to be the between for a reason. And when you give Roxas, Xion, and Nominee vessels, you remove that entire argument. You remove that entire narrative of how there are always going to be people in the margins, and learning to, in many ways, respect that. Respect that there are going to be fringe things that you are not going to be able to just put in a box and make it okay. And my fear here is that that will eventually come and bite them in the butt later down the road with this franchise. Because we're going into Lost Masters arc territory, right? There's going to be, and I have no back knowledge of this, by the way, this is all just assumptions, this is all just my ramblings. There's going to be a lot of body hopping happening. There's going to be a lot of stuff that is not going to be so easily explained away, that needs the structure of what's happened in the Dark Seeker saga to kind of give it some sort of structure. Because one of the things that has surprised me quite a bit is the way at the end of, and I mean at the very end of Kingdom Hearts 3, when we see Lucio and the other foretellers back at the Keyblade Graveyard with the box, right? We know, because we have witnessed it from the secret reports, we have seen it in various other iterations, that we know Lucio has gone through many a millennia at this point, body hopping, essentially, right? So we know that this is not new, and certainly wouldn't be unique to Roxas, Xion, and Lea, right? Because essentially that is what they are doing. They're body hopping. They're literally just hopping into a new vessel. But if we don't address the fact that the criteria here could be different, then Arlott are playing God with forces that they're not aware they're playing God with. Or that there will be a point in time where, as we saw with Riku Replica, the evil version, when he got his spirit yeeted out of by the good Riku Replica, it's a whole scene in the Keyblade Graveyard where Riku's like looking at him being like, take the vessel. If that felt a very simple action for good Riku Replica to do, to yeet the bad Riku Replica out of the vessel. And that's always kind of given me a bit of an ick. I don't know how many people have played Fallout 4, but there's this whole notion that the Commonwealth has largely been colonized by robots from the Institute. And so you're not really sure who you're talking to is a synth or who isn't, and it's a big point of contention. Or well, it's meant to be a big point of contention. It's not actually that big of a point of contention, because the Institute are useless. But I fear, if we are simply only spirits inhabiting a shell, is that the same thing as being a full-bodied person? I'm not sure I have a good enough answer for that, but my inclination would be no. Because I'll put it to you this way. There then becomes a human distinction at play. Because you cannot, in the majority of cases, especially in the world of Kingdom Hearts, run up to somebody else and yeet their spirit from their body, right? Not in the way we saw Riku Replica yeet his evil self for Nominee, right? This would imply that something similar would be possible because they are simply piloting the mech, right? It's not actually their body. When we don't see the same thing happening with Riku, Sora, and Kairi, you don't see them randomly bumping into each other and then, their souls popping out of their bodies, right? So we're suddenly going to be in a different subclass when it comes to our nobody friends having bodies that aren't really ever their own. Not in the same way that their fully whole counterparts do. And it would be a bit much to say that would be a class division, but it does imply that it's something that's not actually ever going to be achievable or attainable in the way that they would want it to be. And I don't like this idea of somebody just being able to yeet somebody else out of their corpse, essentially, out of their replica. But given the amount of body hopping that the foretellers are using, we see four of the foretellers with Lushu in their original forms that they previously had in Union Cross, which doesn't make a huge amount of sense because we know that the form that Lushu has now isn't his OG form from back in the back cover days. So how come the others still have their forms after a war and that subsequently they were able to still keep their bodies even though we know canonically at this point that several millennia have passed since the original Keyblade War? I only say millennia because it's what Lushu mentions in the secret reports. So it's what's come to mind first. But that's an interesting prospect to me. Because what effect does that then have that his body is not his own? Because we don't really know in a lot of ways because we've never gotten a lot of the information. I will dig through Vexen's character files to see specifically about if there's any research on his vessels specifically, but as far as I'm aware, they're pretty short. We don't really know the full extent of how the vessels do or do not work. We just know that they do. Obviously, we had the original program in Chain of Memories, and then they were perfected by the time we got to 3. But we don't really know the constraints around them. What we have seen with the quote-unquote perfected ones that Roxas, Nominee, and Xion now have is ones that can be in some ways exploited. If you are tired or overwhelmed or whatever, you can just be overtaken. I'm like, and that just makes me uncomfy. I can say it. That just makes me uncomfy. And that doesn't leave me with good feelies anywhere, thinking that through. So yeah, you can understand why I would want to have a conversation about how whether or not the three of them really add things in a way that ties things up, because I'm sure that outside from the peer pressure of people wanting them in and them having a happy ending of some description, I never saw the ending of 2 as being the bad ending for Naminé, Roxas, and Xion. Like, I never saw it that way, because they were always parts of a whole. And in many ways, like, were necessary for reforming Sora. So I don't understand how now they can exist without Sora suddenly independently. That's weird, when the whole shtick was you have to return to Sora, otherwise, you know, memories won't be completed and he won't wake up and he'll be a shell of himself. Like, you undo all of that work by giving them vessels at the end. Unless I'm missing something pretty obvious. But I don't think I am. Because it makes that whole point of, like, why not just make the chains without him then? Like, or make the chains but not have him return. Like, surely that was a possible thing to have happened. But I think that's where we'll end it for now. This has been Thinking Through the Darkness, a Lore by Spec production with me, Spec. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate you taking the time to hang out with me today. Just as a reminder, don't forget, if you haven't followed the Lore by Spec YouTube channel, go ahead and subscribe. It's free there. If you haven't taken the time to review the podcast or dropped a like and a comment, those really help too. And if you ever feel inclined to help me keep the lights on over here, head to Ko-Fi, which is in my description, to help support the podcast. Once again, thank you all so very much for listening, and I will see you all next time.